The sun was setting over the airport, casting a golden glow on the bustling terminals and the endless rows of planes waiting to take off. Inside the airport lounge, passengers hurried to their gates, their voices blending into a symphony of announcements, footsteps, and the occasional clatter of luggage wheels. Among them was James Carter, a black soldier returning home from his latest deployment. Dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, James carried himself with a quiet dignity, his eyes betraying a wariness that only years of service and countless battles could bring. James had been through this airport countless times, but tonight felt different. He wasn't just heading home. He was heading toward a well-deserved break, a brief respite from the chaos of the world. In his hand he held a first-class ticket, a gift from his commanding officer in recognition of his service. It was a small but meaningful gesture, one that made James feel, for once, like the sacrifices he had made were truly appreciated. As James approached the gate, he noticed the flight crew preparing for boarding. Among them was Sarah, a flight attendant with years of experience under her belt. Sarah was known for her professionalism, but her demeanor often carried an air of superiority. Her sharp features and perfectly styled hair gave her a polished appearance, but her eyes lacked warmth. She prided herself on maintaining strict order on her flights, often going above and beyond to enforce rules, sometimes to the discomfort of others. James handed his boarding pass to the attendant at the gate, who smiled warmly and thanked him for his service. As he stepped onto the plane, his eyes scanned the luxurious first-class cabin. Plush leather seats, ample legroom, and a quiet ambience welcomed him. It was a world away from the cramped economy seats he was used to. James found his seat near the window, placed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in, feeling a rare sense of peace wash over him. Minutes later, Sarah began her routine walk through the first-class cabin, ensuring everything was in order. Her eyes fell on James, and for a moment her expression faltered. She approached him with a brisk step, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone cold and clipped. "Can I see your boarding pass?" James, taken aback but polite as always, retrieved the pass from his pocket and handed it to her. Sarah examined it with a scrutinizing eye, her lips pressing into a thin line. "There must be some mistake," she said, handing it back. "This is a first-class seat." James nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, it is. That's what my ticket says." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She looked around as if expecting someone to back her up, then leaned in closer. "Sir, first-class seating is reserved for passengers who have paid for it or have earned the privilege. Are you sure this is your seat?" James straightened in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'm certain. I've served my country for over a decade. This ticket was given to me in recognition of that service." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of other passengers. "I'm sorry, but we have protocols to follow. If you don't belong here, I'll have to ask you to move to economy." The cabin grew silent as passengers watched the scene unfold. Some whispered among themselves, others glanced at James with expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort. James, feeling the weight of the stairs, took a deep breath. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice steady. "This is my seat." Sarah's face hardened. "I'll have to speak with the captain about this," she said before walking away, leaving James to sit alone under the watchful eyes of the other passengers. As the moments passed, tension filled the cabin. James remained in his seat, his mind racing. He had faced countless challenges in his life. Dangerous missions, sleepless nights, and the constant fear of losing his brothers in arms. But this felt different. This was a battle he hadn't prepared for, one fought not with weapons, but with dignity and resolve. When Sarah returned, she wasn't alone. A second flight attendant followed behind her, their expression less severe but equally uncertain. "Sir," Sarah began, her tone icy, "we've confirmed that you'll need to move to economy. Please gather your belongings." James looked her in the eye, his voice calm but unyielding. "No, this is my seat." The second attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sarah," they began, but she cut them off. "We have procedures to follow," Sarah snapped. This is non-negotiable. James remained seated, his posture firm, his resolve unwavering. The tension in the cabin reached its peak, and then something unexpected happened. A passenger sitting nearby, a well-dressed man with silver hair, stood up. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This gentleman claims to have a first-class ticket," Sarah said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "But it's clear there's been a mistake." The man raised an eyebrow, looking between Sarah and James. "A mistake. The only mistake I see here is how you're treating him." Sarah's face flushed, but before she could respond, more passengers began speaking up. One by one, voices of support for James filled the cabin, challenging Sarah's actions and questioning her motives. And then, just as the situation seemed to spiral further out of control, the captain appeared in the aisle. His expression was unreadable, but his presence commanded attention. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." As the captain and Sarah stepped aside, James remained in his seat, his heart pounding. The whispers of the passengers filled the silence, and the question lingered in the air. What would happen next? The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was thick with tension. The passengers who had spoken up now exchanged glances, their murmurs blending into the faint hum of the aircraft. Some stared at James with quiet support, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unsure of how to process what was unfolding. James sat silently, his posture unwavering, but his thoughts a storm. He could feel the weight of the stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. What would the captain decide? Why was this happening? He had faced danger on the battlefield, but somehow this confrontation felt uniquely exhausting. In the galley, just out of earshot from the cabin, the captain stood face to face with Sarah. His arms were crossed, his expression serious. "Explain to me," he said in a measured tone, "why you've escalated this situation." Sarah's composure faltered slightly under the captain's scrutiny. "Captain," she began, her voice defensive, "I was following procedure. This passenger's appearance and demeanor, it just didn't seem like he belonged in first class. I thought it was my responsibility to verify." The captain held up a hand, cutting her off. "Did you check his ticket?" "Yes," Sarah replied quickly, though her voice wavered. "But I just." "Did the ticket say first class?" he pressed, his tone sharper now. "It did," she admitted, her cheeks reddening. "But you know as well as I do, sometimes these things happen. Mistakes with upgrades, fraud." The captain's eyes narrowed. "And your assumption was based on what exactly?" Sarah hesitated, her lips tightening. She couldn't bring herself to say it aloud. But the implication was clear. The captain's expression darkened. "We have a duty to treat every passenger with respect. This man's a decorated soldier. Not that it should even matter for this discussion. What you've done here is unacceptable, Sarah." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, James sat quietly, replaying the events in his mind. He wasn't unfamiliar with moments like these. Throughout his life, he had learned to carry himself with grace and restraint, even when faced with unfairness. Growing up in a small town, James had often been underestimated, judged not by his character, but by his appearance. It was those experiences that had fueled his determination to serve his country, to prove that he was capable of achieving great things despite the obstacles placed before him. Yet, moments like this reminded him that no matter how far he'd come, the world still had a way of pulling him back, forcing him to fight battles he shouldn't have to. He glanced around the cabin, noting the mix of emotions on the faces of his fellow passengers. Some looked apologetic, their eyes silently urging him to stay strong. Others appeared indifferent, clearly wishing the situation would resolve so they could move on with their flight. A young woman sitting a few rows ahead caught attention. She turned in her seat, offering him a small, encouraging smile. Her gesture, though simple, felt like a lifeline in an otherwise isolating moment. James nodded in acknowledgement, his heart steadying just a little. Behind him, an older man whispered to his wife, "It's disgraceful, the way she spoke to him. Doesn't she realize what a uniform like that represents?" The woman nodded, her expression stern. "I hope the captain does the right thing. James heard bits and pieces of the conversations around him, but chose not to respond. He had learned long ago that dignity was often the most powerful response to adversity. Still, the knot in his stomach remained. He wasn't angry, not entirely. He was disappointed, wary of the subtle and overt ways that the world continued to test him. A few minutes later, the captain returned to the cabin, his face calm but serious. Sarah followed a step behind, her head held high, but her cheeks flushed. The second flight attendant trailed behind them, her expression tense, clearly bracing for what was to come. The captain addressed the cabin, his voice steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. There appears to have been a misunderstanding, but I assure you we are resolving it." He turned to James, meeting his gaze directly. "Mr. Carter, I want to personally thank you for your service. On behalf of the airline, I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced tonight. You are, of course, welcome to remain in your assigned seat." James nodded politely, his voice calm. "Thank you, Captain." The captain's words should have been the end of it, but the atmosphere in the cabin didn't immediately ease. Sarah's face was tight with barely concealed frustration, and though she didn't say anything, her body language spoke volumes. The tension lingered like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. As the captain walked back toward the cockpit, a soft ripple of applause broke out from a few passengers. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Sarah's cheeks flush deeper. She turned sharply and disappeared into the galley, leaving the second attendant to finish the pre-flight preparations. James leaned back in his seat, his body finally relaxing, though his mind remained alert. The ordeal had been humiliating, but he refused to let it ruin the journey ahead. He glanced out the window at the darkening sky, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence. The plane would be taking off soon, and he was determined to leave this moment behind. But just as he thought the situation was over, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." James turned to see the older man who had spoken earlier standing in the aisle beside him. The man extended his hand, his expression warm and genuine. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for this country." James shook the man's hand, his grip firm but humble. "Thank you," he replied softly. The man nodded, then returned to his seat, but his simple gesture left an impact. It reminded James that for every moment of adversity, there were still people who recognized and valued his worth. It was a small comfort, but it was enough. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, James closed his eyes, letting the gentle vibrations of the aircraft soothe his restless mind. He didn't know what awaited him once the plane landed, but for now he allowed himself a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe, to reflect, and to remind himself of the strength that had carried him through every challenge before this one. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that this wasn't the end of the story. Something about Sarah's behavior, her unwavering insistence despite clear evidence, felt personal. James had encountered people like her before, people who hid prejudice behind policy, who clung to their authority as a shield for their biases. He wondered if she would face any consequences for her actions, or if this would simply become another unresolved chapter in his long history of navigating a world that so often underestimated him. And as the plane lifted into the sky, carrying him toward home, James couldn't help but feel that the turbulence he'd experienced on the ground might only be the beginning. The plane ascended into the night sky, its cabin settling into an uneasy quiet. The usual hum of first class, glasses clinking, low murmurs of conversation, was absent. Passengers still exchanged glances, the earlier confrontation lingering like a heavy fog. James stared out the window, the twinkling lights of the city below gradually fading into darkness. Though he outwardly appeared calm inside, his mind churned with thoughts he couldn't quite shake. Sarah, meanwhile, remained in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She replayed the captain's words over and over, each one feeling like a personal blow. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. She had followed her instincts, hadn't she? And yet, the passengers had turned against her, the captain had reprimanded her, and now she was left to stew in the aftermath of a decision that felt, to her, entirely justified. Her colleague, the second flight attendant, peeked into the galley, her expression hesitant. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Sarah waved her off, her voice sharp. "I'm fine." "You don't seem fine," the other attendant said, stepping closer. "Look, I know things got tense back there, but maybe you could have handled it differently." Sarah shot her a glare. "Handled it differently? Are you serious? You saw him. He didn't belong in first class." The other attendant blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" "He had a ticket. It's not our job to decide who belongs." Sarah opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself, realizing the implications of her words. She turned back to the counter, her jaw tight. "Never mind," she muttered. "Just leave me alone." As the other attendant walked away, her brow furrowed with concern, Sarah's thoughts spiraled further. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being judged unfairly. But deep down, another thought crept in, one she tried to push away. What if she had made a mistake? The idea gnawed at her, leaving her unsettled. Back in his seat, James was doing his best to focus on the journey ahead. He had spent the last few weeks in a combat zone, enduring grueling conditions and constant danger. This flight was supposed to be his chance to decompress, to feel, if only for a few hours, like a regular person instead of a soldier. But instead, he had been thrust into yet another situation that forced him to prove himself, to defend his place in a space he had every right to occupy. He glanced at the passengers around him, noting their varied reactions. The older man who had spoken up earlier now sat quietly, flipping through a magazine, but he occasionally glanced at James, offering small, supportive nods. The young woman ahead had put in her headphones, though she still cast the occasional look over her shoulder. And then there were those who avoided eye contact entirely, burying themselves in books or tablets, pretending the incident hadn't happened. James wasn't angry at them. He understood that people didn't always know how to respond to moments like these, but their silence, their reluctance to fully engage, reminded him of all the times he had faced adversity alone. He had learned to carry that weight, to bear it without complaint, but it didn't make it any less heavy. The flight continued, the cabin lights dimming as the plane cruised at altitude. Most passengers settled into their seats, some dozing off, while others watched movies or quietly worked. James trying to do the same, but his mind wouldn't quiet. He thought about his family waiting for him back home, the friends he hadn't seen in months, and the brief moments of peace he had allowed himself to imagine during this trip. He wondered if they would understand what had happened tonight, if they would feel the same mixture of exhaustion and determination that he felt now. In the galley, Sarah finally emerged, her composure carefully restored. She walked through the cabin with a forced smile, checking on passengers and avoiding James's row entirely. When she reached the older man who had spoken up earlier, he fixed her with a pointed stare. "You owe that man an apology," he said quietly but firmly. Sarah stiffened, her smile faltering. "Excuse me." "You heard me," the man replied, his tone unwavering. "What you did back there was wrong. And if you can't see that, maybe you shouldn't be working in customer service." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps brisk and deliberate. The man shook his head, muttering something under his breath before returning to his magazine. As the flight wore on, James finally allowed himself to close his eyes, hoping for even a brief moment of rest. But just as he began to drift off, a soft voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." He opened his eyes to see the young woman from a few rows ahead standing in the aisle, her hands clasped nervously. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened earlier. You didn't deserve that." James offered her a small smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." She hesitated, then added, "My brother's in the military too. I know how much you guys sacrifice, and it's not fair what you went through tonight." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not the first time," he said quietly, "but I appreciate your kindness." The woman smiled softly before returning to her seat, leaving James alone with his thoughts once again. Her words, though brief, had a soothing effect, reminding him that even in moments of conflict, there were people willing to stand by him. But even as the plane cruised smoothly through the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that the conflict with Sarah wasn't truly over. Her behavior had been too deliberate, too pointed to simply dismissed as a misunderstanding. And as much as he wanted to put the incident behind him, a part of him knew that moments like these didn't just resolve themselves. There were always ripple effects, consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. James leaned back in his seat, staring at the dark expanse of sky outside the window. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing. He would face it, as he always had, with strength and dignity. And no matter how turbulent the journey became, he wouldn't let it break him. The hours dragged on, the plane slicing through the vast darkness of the sky, but the tension in the cabin hadn't completely dissolved. James had tried to close his eyes again, forcing his mind to focus on the rhythmic hum of the engines, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. Something about the earlier exchange lingered, like a wound that hadn't quite healed. He wasn't one to dwell on things he couldn't control, but the deliberate nature of Sarah's actions gnawed at him. It wasn't just the insult. It was the cold precision of it, the way she had stood her ground even when faced with the truth. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his calm tone providing a brief distraction. He announced the flight's progress, estimated time of arrival, and the weather conditions at their destination. The passengers shifted slightly in their seats, adjusting blankets and reaching for drinks. It was a simple, routine announcement, but it reminded everyone that the journey wasn't over yet. James opened his eyes and glanced around. The young woman who had spoken to him earlier was now asleep, her head resting against the window. The older man nearby gave him another brief, encouraging nod, but otherwise the cabin was quiet. Yet, something felt off, an inexplicable tension that seemed to settle over everything. In the galley, Sarah paced back and forth, her mind racing. The captain's reprimand still echoed in her ears, and the older man's pointed words replayed in her head like a loop she couldn't escape. She was angry, yes, but not just at them. She was angry at herself. Something about the way James had looked at her earlier, calm, composed, almost pitching, had struck a nerve. It wasn't the reaction she had expected. She had been so sure she was in the right. But now, doubt crept in, unwelcome and persistent. Her colleague entered the galley, her steps hesitant. "Sarah," she began cautiously, "can we talk?" Sarah crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "About what?" Her colleague sighed, glancing toward the cabin. "About what happened earlier. Look, I don't want to make this worse, but I think you need to apologize." Sarah stiffened, her jaw tightening. "Apologize? Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea how much pressure we're under on these flights? How many rules we have to follow? How much judgment we have to make on the spot? I did what I thought was right." "But was it right?" Her colleague pressed gently. "You didn't just question his seat. You questioned him. And that's not the same thing." Sarah turned away, her arms still crossed, but her colleague's words hit their mark. She didn't respond, instead staring out the small galley window at the inky blackness outside. Her colleague sighed again, then stepped back into the cabin, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. In first class, the older man who had defended James earlier leaned over to his wife. "You know," he whispered, "I think we should say something to the captain after the flight. What she did, it's not right." His wife nodded, her expression firm. "Absolutely. Someone has to hold her accountable." The whispering didn't go unnoticed. A few other passengers nearby exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of agreement and unease. They had seen enough to understand the situation, but like so many bystanders in moments of conflict, they weren't sure how to act. Still, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted slightly, the quiet solidarity among the passengers growing stronger. James, ever perceptive, picked up on the subtle change. He didn't know exactly what was being said, but he could feel the shift in energy around him. It was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because he wasn't entirely alone in this, and unsettling because he could sense that the situation wasn't truly resolved. There was still something simmering beneath the surface, something that hadn't yet come to a boil. As the plane began its gradual descent, the captain made another announcement, asking passengers to prepare for landing. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash and ensuring everything was in order. Sarah avoided James's row entirely, her movements quick and mechanical. But even as she focused on her tasks, her mind raced. She knew the captain would file a report about the incident, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight might have lasting consequences, not just for James, but for her as well. James watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting her stiff posture and averted gaze. He didn't need an apology from her, not really. But he couldn't help wondering what had driven her to act the way she had. Was it ignorance? Bias? Something deeper? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let this experience define him. He had faced far greater challenges in his life, and he wasn't about to let a single moment of prejudice overshadow his journey. As the plane made its final approach, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Sarah's colleague shot her a worried glance, but Sarah ignored it, focusing instead on the landing preparations. The older man leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Sarah, as if waiting for her to make a move. The young woman who had spoken to James earlier stirred awake, her eyes flickering with recognition as she remembered the events of the flight. And James, calm and steady as ever, tightened his grip on the armrest, bracing himself, not for the landing, but for whatever awaited him once the plane touched down. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, the plane jolting slightly as it began to slow. The passengers let out a collective breath, some stretching and reaching for their belongings. But the underlying tension remained, unspoken but palpable. James glanced at his watch, the ticking seconds feeling heavier than usual. He had no idea what was coming next, but he could sense that the story wasn't over. Not yet. As the plane taxied to the gate, the air inside the cabin felt heavy, an unspoken tension gripping everyone who had witnessed the earlier exchange. James sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of his boarding pass. He didn't want to think about what had happened, but the events of the flight kept replaying in his mind. Each detail seemed sharper now, the shift in Sarah's tone, the way she had ignored his ticket, and the pointed looks from other passengers. He told himself to let it go, to leave the moment behind once he stepped off the plane, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Passengers began gathering their belongings as the seatbelt sign dimmed. Overhead bins clicked open, suitcases shifted, and a chorus of murmured goodbyes to the flight crew filled the cabin. James stayed seated, watching the movement around him with a quiet intensity. He was in no rush. He knew the journey wasn't truly over until he stepped into the fresh air outside the terminal. Sarah stood near the front of the plane, her face set in an unreadable mask as she bid farewell to passengers. Her voice was polite, rehearsed, but there was no warmth behind it. She avoided eye contact with anyone who might remind her of the earlier confrontation, especially James. Her colleague stood nearby, her gaze flicking between Sarah and the passengers, as if waiting for something to happen. When James finally rose, his movements deliberate, the other passengers gave him space, parting slightly as he walked toward the exit. A few offered him nods or small smiles, subtle gestures of support. The older man who had spoken up earlier reached out to lightly touch his arm as he passed. "Good luck, son," he said quietly. James offered a grateful nod in return, his voice steady. "Thank you." As he approached the exit, Sarah tensed. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say something, her lips parting slightly, but the words didn't come. Instead, a colleague stepped forward, her voice kind but firm. "Thank you for your service," she said, her eyes meeting James's. James gave her a small, respectful smile. "I appreciate that," he replied, his tone measured. He walked off the plane without another word, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The tension between him and Sarah was left hanging in the air, unresolved, like a storm that hadn't fully broken. Sarah exhaled softly, her shoulders dropping slightly as she watched him go. But just as she began to relax, a voice crackled over her earpiece, pulling her back into the moment. "Sarah, we need you in the galley now." "There's an issue," the captain's voice said, calm but firm. She frowned, her heart skipping a beat. Issues after landing were rare, and they were never good news. She hurried toward the galley, where her colleague was already waiting, her face pale. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice sharper than intended. A colleague hesitated, then held up a clipboard with the passenger manifest. "There's been a complaint," she said softly. "About you?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "A complaint? From who?" A colleague glanced toward the front of the plane, where the older man who had defended James earlier was standing just outside the cabin door, speaking quietly to the captain. Sarah's pulse quickened as the realization hit her. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice tight. A colleague nodded. "He says your behavior toward Mr. James was unacceptable. He's requesting a formal review." Sarah's mind raced. A formal review could mean anything from a warning to termination, depending on the airline's policies and the severity of the complaint. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel the weight of the older man's disapproval, the captain's quiet judgment, and the passengers' lingering unease pressing down on her all at once. As the passengers disembarked and filtered into the terminal, James was greeted by a surprising sight. A small group of airport staff stood near the gate, their faces lighting up as they spotted him. One of them, a middle-aged man with a friendly smile, stepped forward and extended a hand. "Sergeant Walker, right?" he said warmly. "We heard you were coming through. Thank you for your service." James blinked, caught off guard, but he shook the man's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice humble. The group had clearly been alerted to his arrival in advance, though James wasn't sure how or by whom. They led him toward the terminal exit, offering him coffee and small snacks along the way. The gesture was kind, genuine, and completely unexpected, but it only made the earlier events of the flight feel even more surreal. As James reached the terminal doors, he turned back for a moment, his gaze scanning the crowd of passengers spilling out into the airport. He didn't see Sarah, but he didn't need to. Her absence spoke louder than her presence ever could. Back on the plane, Sarah sat in the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cup of water. The captain had spoken to her briefly, his tone neutral, but his words pointed. The complaint was serious, and it would be addressed by the airline's management team. Sarah nodded numbly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. But just as she began to process what had happened, her earpiece crackled again. "Sarah," the captain's voice said, low and tense, "I need you to come to the cockpit immediately. There's something you need to see." Her breath caught. She didn't ask questions, didn't argue. She simply rose and walked toward the cockpit, her mind racing. Whatever was waiting for her there, she knew it wasn't going to make her night any easier. As she stepped into the small, confined space, the captain turned to face her, his expression grim. He held up a piece of paper, the edges slightly crumpled. "This just came through from the terminal," he said quietly. "It's about the passenger you confronted." Sarah's heart pounded as she took the paper from his hands, her eyes scanning the words. The message was brief but clear, outlining James's service record and commendations. But at the bottom, there was an additional note, one that made Sarah's blood run cold. The note simply read, "Immediate action required. Contact HR before next flight." Sarah's hands shook as she lowered the paper, her mind spinning. The flight had ended, but the repercussions of her actions were only beginning to unfold. And as she stood there, staring at the captain's expectant face, she realized that this wasn't just about James or the passengers' complaints. This was about her choices, and the consequences she could no longer outrun. Sarah's heart pounded as she left the cockpit, the weight of the captain's words echoing her mind. The paper she had just read felt heavier than it was, as though the truth of it was sinking into her hands. The note wasn't just a warning, it was a reckoning. She walked back to the galley on shaky legs, every step accompanied by a swirl of emotions she couldn't quite sort out: fear, shame, and something unfamiliar that might have been regret. Meanwhile, James stepped outside the terminal, his breath catching as the cold night air hit his face. The small group of airport staff who had greeted him moments earlier had already dispersed, leaving him alone in the vast parking area. He paused by a bench, setting his carry-on bag down and taking a moment to gather himself. The kindness from strangers had been touching, but the events on the flight lingered, leaving a bittersweet taste in his mouth. He wanted to put it behind him, but something about the whole ordeal refused to let go. Back on the plane, Sarah sat in the now empty cabin, her hands clasped tightly together. The other crew members had already disembarked, but she had been asked to stay behind to meet with airline management via video call. The captain had handed her one last directive before leaving. Be honest. Whatever happens next, it'll depend on how you handle this. The words had felt more like advice than an order, but they still filled her with dread. As the screen on the cockpit's communication panel flickered to life, Sarah's stomach churned. A stern-looking woman appeared, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself as the airline's HR director and wasted no time addressing the situation. Sarah, we've reviewed the complaint from today's flight, along with passenger testimonials and the captain's report. The woman began. This is a serious matter. The actions you took were not only unprofessional, but also discriminatory. We take these allegations very seriously. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the woman raised a hand to stop her. Before you say anything, I want you to know that we've also received an independent statement from the passenger in question, Mr. James Walker. Sarah froze, her heart sinking further. What had James said? Did he demand she be fired? Was his statement a damning recount of her behavior? Her mind raced as the HR director continued. Mr. Walker's statement was unexpected, the woman said, her tone softening just slightly. He acknowledged the severity of the incident, but specifically requested that we consider a path of growth rather than punitive action. In his words, he believes education and accountability are more impactful than punishment. Sarah blinked, her mouth going dry. Of all the possible outcomes, this was the last thing she had anticipated. The man she had wronged, publicly humiliated even, had asked for mercy. It didn't erase what she had done, but it left her stunned. The HR director's gaze sharpened. That said, this doesn't absolve you of responsibility. The airline's reputation relies on the professionalism and fairness of its staff. We are requiring you to attend a comprehensive training program on cultural sensitivity and bias awareness. Furthermore, you'll be placed on probation for 6 months. Any further incidents of this nature will result in immediate termination. Do you understand? Sarah nodded slowly, her throat tight. Yes, I understand. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah alone in the dim cockpit. She sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her. James' unexpected grace felt like a lifeline, but it also deepened her guilt. She hadn't earned his forgiveness. Not yet. The next morning, James walked into the airport lounge, his posture as steady as ever. He had a connecting flight in a few hours and planned to grab a coffee and relax before heading to his gate. As he approached the counter, a familiar figure caught his eye. Standing a few feet away, nervously clutching a to-go cup, was Sarah. Her uniform was neatly pressed, but her face carried the wariness of someone who hadn't slept. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sarah hesitantly stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Walker, she began, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I was wrong. James regarded her carefully, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, letting the weight of her words settle between them. Finally, he nodded. Thank you for saying that, he replied simply. Sarah exhaled, a small measure of relief washing over her. I'm working on being better, she added, her tone earnest. I know that doesn't fix what happened, but I wanted you to know. James studied her for a moment, then offered a faint smile. That's a start, he said. The rest is up to you. Sarah nodded, her gratitude evident. As James turned to leave, she called out softly, And thank you for what you said to HR. You didn't have to do that. James glanced back, his gaze steady. No, I didn't. But sometimes grace is the better choice. As he walked away, Sarah stood in place, holding on to those words. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew this moment would stay with her, a reminder of how one choice could change everything. Just as James reached the lounge exit, his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, expecting a routine notification. Instead, it was an email from the airline. Opening it, he saw a message thanking him for his service, with a complimentary upgrade voucher for his next flight. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head. Sometimes the universe had a strange way of balancing the scales. Outside the day was bright, the world moving forward as it always did. But for James and Sarah, something had shifted, small, perhaps, but meaningful. A lesson learned, a path corrected, and a chance, however fragile, for something better.